What's up guys? Today is going to be a pretty simple video. In the past, I've discussed banning Pokemon like Palafin, Kyurem, and Ogerpon Wellspring, and we've gone over concepts like the uncompetitive nature of freezing, or the excessive pressure that Wellspring exerts on bulkier teams, and the overall metagame impact of Palafin. Well, today is not about abstract concepts. It's about a sweeper that's too good at sweeping. You don't need to think too hard about this. You don't need to be a team builder to understand this. You don't need to think about what you want the metagame to be. The format for this video will be simple. I'll go over the common Roaring Moon sets, then I'll review every common check and counter and assess how effective they are. Let's start with the common sets, and we'll begin with the non-problematic sets. First up is Choice Scarf. These sets will run U-Turn, Knockoff, and then some combination of Outrage, Earthquake, Iron Head, and Stone Edge. This set provides a solid offensive speedy pivot with decent power. It's used most commonly on offense and balanced teams. It's not broken at all, and anyone who tells you otherwise doesn't know what they're talking about. It functions very similarly to Choice Scarf Meowscarada, and generally speaking is a very typical Choice Scarfer. Choice Band runs the same moves as Choice Scarf, just opting for power instead of speed. Once again, Choice Band is not broken at all. It's very similar to Choice Band Meowscarada or Choice Band Weavile. It's strong and has knockoff, which is great, but it's not very difficult to wall. Next, there are Dragon Dance sets that don't run Booster Energy. These are most commonly seen on Sun teams, and they are absolutely terrifying on Sun, but given that you need Sun to be up for these strats to be truly potent, almost nobody considers them broken. Now, on to the real problem here. Dragon Dance with Booster Energy. There are 5 main variants. We've got Tera Flying, Tera Fairy, Tera Ghost, Tera Ground, and Tera Dragon. All these sets run Knockoff and Dragon Dance with Booster Energy to boost attack. They can be Jolly or Adamant, although Adamant with defense investment has been very popular lately. Tera Flying always runs Acrobatics, and for the last slot we'll choose between Earthquake, Substitute, Roost, Taunt, and Brick Break. Tera Fairy will run Tera Blast Fairy, and almost always runs Roost, but it can also use Taunt, Earthquake, or Substitute in the last slot. Tera Ghost and Tera Ground will both run Earthquake, and for the last slot typically choose Roost, but it can also run Taunt, Acrobatics, or Substitute. Tera Dragon will run Outrage and Iron Head to hit Fairy types in the last slot. Some will choose to run different sets, but these 5 are by far the most common. And the fun part is, since they all use Booster Energy, Dragon Dance, and Knockoff, you really have no way of knowing what Tera it is until it actually uses the Tera, likely KOing a Pokemon or gaining an additional turn of setup. The goal of these sets is simple. Sweep and win the game, or do as much damage as possible before dying. So, how can you combat these Roaring Moon sets, defensively or offensively? I'll start with the defensive answers, then we'll discuss offensive answers. First up is Landorus Therian. This alone isn't nearly enough to stop Roaring Moon, but it does help. Landorus enters, gets an Intimidate, and then U-turns out. U-turn will do about half to Roaring Moon unless it uses Tera. Suppose you're facing a Tera Fairy or Flying Roaring Moon, it can still Dragon Dance as Landorus enters, Tera, and Dragon Dance again. But you did force the Tera. Substitute sets can also take advantage of Landorus on the U-turn. Basically, Landorus gets solid damage or forces Tera, which is great, but it definitely can't stop Roaring Moon on its own. Next up is Gliscor. Healthy Gliscor can take a hit from Roaring Moon and go for Toxic, although it will lose most of its health. Even with Protect though, you're not taking 2 hits, so you'll need to switch out to stall for Toxic damage, leading to death or a lot of damage on something else. Roaring Moon can also use Dragon Dance and Roost on Protect turns, making Gliscor a risky answer. That's not to mention if you face Substitute or Taunt Roaring Moon, then Gliscor becomes setup fodder, especially if Tera Flying. Gliscor will also die to Tera Dragon Outrage in one hit, even if max EV'd in defense if the Roaring Moon is at +1. Ultimately, Gliscor is far from a reliable answer, but it can help if the Roaring Moon isn't a certain set. Next, Dondozo. Dondozo can't handle Tera Dragon Outrage, but it can handle every other set with Avalanche, Body Press, or Curse. Dondozo can even beat the taunt sets, although it will end up at very low health at the end of the exchange. Dondozo will also lose its item, which it really hates to do. Still, it's a very, very, very solid answer to Roaring Moon, just not easy to fit onto teams since it usually only works on really bulky teams. Zamazenta is next. This is hardly an answer at all. It loses to most Roaring Moon sets. To avoid dying to Terra Fairy or flying, you need to Terra immediately. Zamazenta most often run Terra Fire or Steel, both of which are weak to Earthquake, a move commonly used by Roaring Moon. Using Zamazenta to deal with Roaring Moon is really rolling the dice, and the dice are loaded in favor of Roaring Moon. Great Tusk is in a similar situation. It needs Terra to answer the common Roaring Moon sets, and even then has no guarantee of winning. Basically, it's a fake answer to Roaring Moon. It won't get the job done. Speaking of fake answers, let's talk about Zapdos. Some think that paralyzing Roaring Moon makes it easier to deal with, which is true, but not if you let it Dragon Dance 3 times. Zapdos switches in, that's 1 Dragon Dance. Thunder Wave, that's 2 Dragon Dances, and then you switch out. That's 3 Dragon Dances. Even when paralyzed at +3 speed, Roaring Moon is still extremely fast, and now it has +3 attack. Moltres is a more real answer. Terra Fire is almost never seen on Roaring Moon. The problem is that you need to be at absolute full health to deal with Roaring Moon. And of course, if you face Substitute or Taunt, you're in serious trouble. The bigger problem, though, is that Roaring Moon is often run on Hyper Offense, and Moltres is usually a major asset against Hyper Offense teams. If you use your Moltres to answer Roaring Moon, you'll take 80% from knockoff, get the Will-O-Wisp off, then die next turn. The burned Roaring Moon is easier to answer, but losing Moltres and then a major chunk of health on something else is far from ideal. Moltres plus something in the back will almost always handle non-sub or taunt Roaring Moon, but it's a trade that the Roaring Moon user is likely all too happy to make. Corviknight is up next, and this one is very unreliable. If you face Terra Ghost, you are setup fodder right away. And even without Terra Ghost, if Stealth Rock is up, Roaring Moon is very likely to kill Corviknight after it uses Iron Defense just by clicking knockoff twice, assuming Corviknight switches in on a Dragon Dance. If you face the right set and manage to bring Corviknight in at full health though, Iron Defense plus Body Press will handle Roaring Moon, but really it's nothing to rely on. Now, Garchomp. Physically defensive Garchomp with Rocky Helmet can live any hit and Dragon Tail Roaring Moon out. The problem here is that you lose to Terra Fairy sets, in fact you become setup fodder, and of course Garchomp needs to be at absolute full health. Defensive Garchomp is used to set hazards, so it's very difficult to keep it at full health by the time a Roaring Moon would come out in a game. You can't rely on Garchomp at all to stop a Roaring Moon, but you can get good damage with Rocky Helmet and Rough Skin if you bait the knockoff. Next, Clefable. This thing gets smoked by Terra. Even with max defense, you might die to Terra Flying Acrobatics, and every Terra type of Roaring Moon other than Dragon uses Clefable as setup fodder. At best, you get off a Thunder Wave, but as I explained with Zapdos, that might not be very helpful. And if you face Terra Ground, you won't even get the chance of full paralysis. Now, unfortunately for OU, that is the full list of common defensive answers. Let's go over some offensive answers. First up is Dragonite. This is kind of a combination between offensive and defensive. Terra Normal Extreme Speed does around 60% to Roaring Moon without any bulk investment, which is very solid damage. If you Terra Dragonite, you survive any hit. If you don't Terra, though, you die to Terra Blast Fairy and Outrage. But if you Terra Normal and the Roaring Moon ends up being Terra Ghost, you're in a very bad spot. Dragonite versus Roaring Moon is a roll of the dice, but it is in favor of the Dragonite user. The only way it really goes poorly is if Roaring Moon is Terra Ghost, which is a very real set, but it's more likely it's one of the other 4 than to be Terra Ghost. So, if your Roaring Moon answers Dragonite, just hope and pray it's not Terra Ghost. Next up is Kingambit. Once Roaring Moon has Terra'd, Kingambit can do a lot with Sucker Punch. It can also Terra to survive most hits from Roaring Moon and do massive damage in return with Iron Head. The problem is Roost. Oftentimes, Kingambit versus Roaring Moon will come down to a Sucker Punch 50-50. And not the false 50-50 where Kingambit has the advantage, an actual 50-50, because if Roaring Moon gets off one roost, it can survive the next Sucker Punch. Kingambit definitely helps against Roaring Moon, but it's not a solid answer. Next up is Scizor, specifically Choice Band Scizor with Tera Steel. Bullet Punch is doing a minimum of 80% against non-bulk invested Roaring Moon. This means that attacking Roaring Moon as it sets up, then finishing it off with Scizor, will work pretty much every time. Scizor is one of the best offensive answers for Roaring Moon, and currently no steel-resistant Tera types are popular on Roaring Moon. Keeping up with the priority conversation, next is Weavile. Weavile works well against Tera Flying and Tera Ground, where Ice Shard does about half from a heavy-duty boot set. If you face any other Tera type though, Ice Shard isn't doing much. It can still pick off a weakened Roaring Moon, which is great, but it's not something to count on alone. And now for more priority, we have Low Kicks. Low Kicks with Choice Band, Tera Bug First Impression will one-shot most Roaring Moon even after Tera, and guaranteed one-shot all Roaring Moon with very minimal chip. It's very solid for answering Moon. The only downside is it's a Low Kicks, and it's not easy to fit onto teams. Lastly, we have Choice Scarf Meowscarada. Back when all Roaring Moon were Tera Flying, this was a great answer with Triple Axel, but now it's not reliable at all. Tera Ghost and Tera Fairy sets can happily set up another Dragon Dance as you go for Triple Axel. You can go for Trick and hope they go for the double Dragon Dance, but you may just end up losing Meowscarada without getting any damage. Okay, so now that I've laid out all the popular defensive and offensive answers, Roaring Moon is probably sounding super broken. Almost nothing was reliable. Now, I would say that's a valid conclusion, but keep in mind a lot of Pokemon in this list, things like Landorus, Gliscor, Zamazenta, Dragonite, Corviknight, Kingambit, these are not hard Pokemon to fit onto teams. And even though no Pokemon other than Dondozo, Lokix, and Scizor can reliably stomp Roaring Moon, a lot of Pokemon on the list can reliably help. Roaring Moon being in the tier doesn't mean you need to run a Dondozo, Lokix, or Scizor. You can run a Dragonite and a Gliscor, or a Weavile and a Garchomp. Pokemon can work together to take Roaring Moon down. Still, so many of these answers, both defensive and offensive, rely on Roaring Moon not being a common Tera type. Do we really want to play this guessing game every time Roaring Moon enters the field? I would say no, and I support banning Roaring Moon. I'd like to hear your thoughts though. Let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree, and tell me why. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment. I'll see you next time.